The Roman kingdom was the period of the ancient Roman civilization characterized by a monarchical form of government of the city of Rome and its territories. Little is certain about the history of the kingdom, as nearly no written records from that time survive, and the histories about it that were written during the Republican Empire are largely based on legends. However, the history of the Roman kingdom began with the city's founding, traditionally dated to 753 BC, with settlements around the Palatine Hill along the river Tiber in central Italy, and ended with the overthrow of the kings and the establishment of the Republic in about 509 BC. Origin: the site of the founding of the Roman kingdom and eventual Republican Empire had a ford where the Tiber could be crossed. The Palatine Hill and hills surrounding it presented easily defensible positions in the wide fertile plains surrounding them. All of these features contributed to the success of the city. The traditional account of Roman history, which has come down to us through Livy, Plutarch, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and others, is that in Rome's first centuries it was ruled by a succession of 7 kings. The traditional chronology, as codified by Varro, allots 243 years for their reigns, an average of almost 35 years, which, since the work of Barthold Georg Niebuhr, has been generally discounted by modern scholarship. The Gauls destroyed much of Rome's historical records when they sacked the city after the Battle of the Allia in 390 BC, and what was left was eventually lost to time or theft. With no contemporary records of the kingdom existing, all accounts of the kings must be carefully questioned. Monarchy. The kings, excluding Romulus, who according to legend held office by virtue of being the city's founder, were all elected by the people of Rome to serve for life, with none of the kings relying on military force to gain or keep the throne. The insignia of the kings of Rome were 12 lictors wielding the fasces bearing axes, the right to sit upon a curule chair, the purple toga picta, red shoes, and a white diadem around the head. Of all these insignia, the most important was the purple toga. When the father of a family was a patrician, the sons were as well. However, if a daughter got married to a man who wasn't a patrician, the sons would never be patricians. A patrician's privileges included interregnum, auspices, and priesthoods. Chief executive: the king was invested with supreme military, executive, and judicial authority through the use of Imperium, formally granted to the king by the Comitia Curiata with the passing of the Lex Curiata Imperia at the beginning of each king's reign. The Imperium of the king was held for life and protected him from ever being brought to trial for his actions. As being the sole owner of Imperium in Rome at the time, the king possessed ultimate executive power and unchecked military authority as the commander-in-chief of all Rome's legions. Also, the laws that kept citizens safe from magistrates' misuse of Imperium did not exist during the monarchical period. Another power of the king was the power to either appoint or nominate all officials to offices. The king would appoint a tribunus cellarum to serve as both the tribune of Ramnus tribe in Rome and as the commander of the king's personal bodyguard, the cellaris. The king was required to appoint the tribune upon entering office, and the tribune left office upon the king's death. The tribune was second in rank to the king and also possessed the power to convene the curiate assembly and lay legislation before it. Another officer appointed by the king was the praefectus urbi, who acted as the warden of the city. When the king was absent from the city, the prefect held all of the king's powers and abilities, even to the point of being bestowed with Imperium while inside the city. The king even received the right to be the only person to appoint patricians to the Senate. Chief priest. What is known for certain is that the king alone possessed the right to the auspice on behalf of Rome as its chief augur, and no public business could be performed without the will of the gods made known through auspices. The people knew the king as a mediator between them and the gods, and thus viewed the king with religious awe. This made the king the head of the national religion and its chief executive. Having the power to control the Roman calendar, he conducted all religious ceremonies and appointed lower religious officers and officers. It is said that Romulus himself instituted the augurs and was believed to have been the best augur of all. Likewise, King Numa Pompilius instituted the pontiffs and through them developed the foundations of the religious dogma of Rome. Chief legislator under the kings. The Senate and Curiate Assembly had very little power and authority. They were not independent bodies in that they didn't possess the right to meet together and discuss questions of state at their own will. They could only be called together by the king and could only discuss the matters the king laid before them. While the Curiate Assembly did have the power to pass laws that had been submitted by the king, the Senate was effectively an honorary council. It could advise the king on his action but by no means could prevent him from acting. The only thing that the king could not do without the approval of the Senate and Curiate Assembly was to declare war against a foreign nation. Chief Judge, the king's Imperium both granted him military powers and qualified him to pronounce legal judgment in all cases as the Chief Justice of Rome. Though he could assign pontiffs to act as minor judges in some cases, he had supreme authority in all cases brought before him, both civil and criminal. This made the king supreme in times of both war and peace. While some writers believed there was no appeal from the king's decisions, others believed that a proposal for appeal could be brought before the king by any patrician during a meeting of the Curiate Assembly. To assist the king, a council advised him during all trials, but this council had no power to control his decisions. Also, 2 criminal detectives were appointed by him as well as a 2-man criminal court which oversaw cases of treason. According to Livy, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the 7th and final king of Rome, judged capital criminal cases without the advice of counselors, thereby creating fear amongst those who might think to oppose him. Election of the kings. Whenever a king died, Rome entered a period of interregnum. Supreme power of the state would devolve to the Senate, which was responsible for finding a new king. The Senate would assemble and appoint one of its own members, the Interrex, to serve for a period of 5 days with the sole purpose of nominating the next king of Rome. After the 5-day period, the Interrex would appoint another senator for another 5-day term. This process would continue until a new king was elected. Once the Interrex found a suitable nominee to the kingship, he would bring the nominee before the Senate and the Senate would review him. If the Senate passed the nominee, the Interrex would convene the Curiate Assembly and preside over it during the election of the king. Once proposed to the Curiate Assembly, the people of Rome could either accept or reject him. If accepted, the king-elect did not immediately enter office. 2 other acts still had to take place before he was invested with the full regal authority and power. First, it was necessary to obtain the divine will of the gods respecting his appointment by means of the auspices, since the king would serve as high priest of Rome. This ceremony was performed by an augur, who conducted the king-elect to the citadel where he was placed on a stone seat as the people waited below. If found worthy of the kingship, the augur announced that the gods had given favorable tokens, thus confirming the king's priestly character. The second act which had to be performed was the conferral of the Imperium upon the king. The Curiate Assembly's previous vote only determined who was to be king, and had not by that act bestowed the necessary power of the king upon him. Accordingly, the king himself proposed to the Curiate Assembly a law granting him Imperium, and the Curiate Assembly by voting in favor of the law would grant it. In theory, the people of Rome elected their leader, but the Senate had most of the control over the process. Senate. According to legend, Romulus established the Senate after he founded Rome by personally selecting the most noble men to serve as a council for the city. As such, the Senate was the king's advisory council as the council of state. The Senate was composed of 300 senators, with 100 senators representing each of the 3 ancient tribes of Rome, the Ramnus, Tities, and Luceris tribes. Within each tribe, a senator was selected from each of the tribe's 10 curii. The king had the sole authority to appoint the senators, but this selection was done in accordance with ancient custom. Under the monarchy, The Senate possessed very little power and authority, as the king held most of the political power of the state and could exercise those powers without the Senate's consent. The chief function of the Senate was to serve as the king's counsel and be his legislative coordinator. Once legislation proposed by the king passed the Comitia Curiata, the Senate could either veto it or accept it as law. The king was, by custom, to seek the advice of the Senate on major issues. However, it was left to him to decide what issues, if any, were brought before them, and he was free to accept or reject their advice as he saw fit. Only the king possessed the power to convene the Senate, except during the interregnum, during which the Senate possessed the authority to convene itself. Legendary kings of Rome. Astronomical year numbering dates are approximate. Consult particular article for details. Romulus was Rome's first king and the city's founder. After the government of Alba was transferred to Numata, Romulus and Remus decided to build a city in the locality where they had been exposed. In 753 BC, Romulus began building the city upon the Palatine Hill. After defeating Remus, Romulus thus became the sole ruler, and the city was called after him. His first work was to fortify the Palatine Hill where he had been brought up. He permitted men of all classes to come to Rome as citizens, including slaves and freemen without distinction. After the claims of religion had been duly acknowledged, Romulus called his people to a council. To unite them into one political body, he gave them a body of laws, which he thought would only be respected by a rude and uncivilized race of men if he inspired them with awe by assuming the outward symbol of power. To provide his citizens with wives, Romulus invited the neighboring tribes to a festival in Rome where he abducted the young women from amongst them. After the ensuing war with the Sabines, Romulus shared the kingship with the Sabine king Titus Tatius. Romulus selected 100 of the most noble men to form the Roman Senate as an advisory council to the king. He surrounded himself great estate and in particular called into his service 12 lictors. Some think he fixed upon this number from the number of the birds who foretold his sovereignty. These men he called paters, and their descendants became the patricians. He created 3 divisions of equites, called centuries: Ramnus, Tities and Luceris. He also divided the populace into 30 curii, named after 30 of the Sabine women who had intervened to end the war between Romulus and Tatius. The curii formed the voting units in the Comitia Curiata. In addition to the war with the Sabines and other tribes after the rape of the Sabine women, Romulus waged war against the Fidenates and Veientus. He reigned for 36 years. After his death at age 54, Romulus was deified as the war god Quirinus and served not only as one of the 3 major gods of Rome but also as the deified likeness of the city of Rome. Numa Pompilius. After Romulus died, there was an interregnum for 1 year, during which 10 men chosen from the Senate governed Rome as successive interreges. Eventually, the Senate chose the Sabine Numa Pompilius to succeed Romulus, on account of his reputation for justice and piety. Numa's reign was marked by peace and religious reform. He constructed a new temple to Janus and, after establishing peace with Rome's neighbors, closed the doors of the temple to indicate a state of peace. They remained closed for the rest of his reign. He established the Vestal Virgins at Rome, as well as the Sauli, and the Flamens for Jupiter, Mars and Quirinus. He also established the office and duties of Pontifex Maximus. Numa reformed the Roman calendar by adjusting it for the solar and lunar year, as well as by adding the months of January and February to bring the total number of months to 12. Numa reigned for 43 years. Tullus Hostilius was warlike like Romulus, and completely unlike Numa in his lack of respect for the gods. Tullus waged war against Alba Longa, Fidenae and Verri and the Sabines. During Tullus's reign, the city of Alba Longa was completely destroyed and Tullus integrated its population into Rome. Tullus is attributed with constructing a new home for the Senate, the Curia Hostilia, which survived for 562 years after his death. According to Livy, Tullus neglected the worship of the gods until, towards the end of his reign, he fell ill and became superstitious. However, when Tullus called upon Jupiter and begged assistance, Jupiter responded with a bolt of lightning that burned the king and his house to ashes. His reign lasted for 31 years. Ancus Marcius. Following the mysterious death of Tullus, the Romans elected a peaceful and religious king in his place, Numa's grandson, Ancus Marcius. Much like his grandfather, Ancus did little to expand the borders of Rome and only fought war to defend the territory. He also built Rome's first prison on the Capitoline Hill. Ancus further fortified the Janiculum Hill on the western bank, and built the first bridge across the Tiber River. He also founded the port of Ostia on the Tyrrhenian Sea and established Rome's first salt works. Rome grew, as Ancus used diplomacy to peacefully unite smaller surrounding cities into alliance with Rome. Thus, he completed the conquest of the Latins and relocated them to the Aventine Hill, thus forming the plebeian class of Romans. He died a natural death, like his grandfather, after 25 years as king, marking the end of Rome's Latin Sabine kings. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the fifth king of Rome and the first of Etruscan birth. After immigrating to Rome, he gained favor with Ancus, who later adopted him as son. Upon ascending the throne, he waged wars against the Sabines and Etruscans, doubling the size of Rome and bringing great treasures to the city. One of his first reforms was to add 100 new members to the Senate from the conquered Etruscan tribes, bringing the total number of senators to 200. He used the treasures Rome had acquired from the conquest to build great monuments for Rome. Among these were Rome's great sewer systems, the Cloaca Maximus, which he used to drain the swamp-like area between the 7 hills of Rome. In its place, he began construction on the Roman Forum. He also founded the Roman Games. Priscus initiated great building projects. The most famous is the Circus Maximus, a giant stadium for chariot races. After that, he started the building of the temple fortress to the god Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. However, before it was completed, he was killed by a son of Ancus Marcius, after 38 years as king. His reign is best remembered for introducing the Roman symbols of military and civil offices, and the Roman triumph, being the first Roman to celebrate one. Servius Tullius Priscus was succeeded by his son-in-law Servius Tullius, Rome's second king of Etruscan birth, and the son of a slave. Like his father-in-law, Servius fought successful wars against the Etruscans. He used the booty to build the first wall all around the 7 hills of Rome, the Pomerium. He also reorganized the army. Servius Tullius instituted a new constitution, further developing the citizen classes. He instituted Rome's first census, which divided the population into 5 economic classes, and formed the Century Assembly. He used the census to divide the population into 4 urban tribes based on location, thus establishing the tribal assembly. He also oversaw the construction of the temple to Diana on the Aventine Hill. Servius' reforms made a big change in Roman life. Voting rights based on socio-economic status, favoring elites. However, over time, Servius increasingly favored the poor in order to gain support from plebs, often at the expense of patricians. After a 44-year reign, Servius was killed in a conspiracy by his daughter Tullia and her husband Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the 7th and final king of Rome, was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. He was the son of Priscus and the son-in-law of Servius, whom he and his wife had killed. Tarquinius waged a number of wars against Rome's neighbors, including against the Volscia, Gabii and the Rutuli. He also secured Rome's position as head of the Latin cities. He also engaged in a series of public works, notably the completion of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and works on the Cloaca Maxima and the Circus Maximus. However, Tarquin's reign is remembered for his use of violence and intimidation to control Rome, and his disrespect of Roman custom and the Roman Senate. Tensions came to a head when the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, wife and daughter to powerful Roman nobles. Lucretia told her relatives about the attack, and committed suicide to avoid the dishonor of the episode. 4 men, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, and including Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, Publius Valerius Poplicola, and Spurius Lucretius Tricipitinus, incited a revolution that deposed and expelled Tarquinius and his family from Rome in 509 BC. Tarquin was viewed so negatively that the word for king, rex, held negative connotation in Latin language until the fall of the Roman Empire. Brutus and Collatinus became Rome's first consuls, marking the beginning of the Roman Republic. This new government would survive for the next 500 years until the rise of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus.